Bueno, gracias por estar aquí en el seminario. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener en vivo al doctor Saulo Soares. Él obtuvo el doctorado en Oceanografía en 2015 por la Universidad de Hawái en Manoa, después de formarse en Oceanología y Oceanografía Física en Brasil. Actualmente es Assistant Project Scientist en Scripps y ahí también realizó una estancia postdoctoral. Su investigación se centra en la observación y el análisis de las corrientes oceánicas, su variabilidad y los procesos que las modulan, con el fin de comprender y predecir mejor el transporte de materiales, tanto benéficos como nocivos, en el océano.
Bueno, gracias por la invitación. Es un placer regresar aquí después de, creo que 10 años. Estuve aquí por una plática. Y bueno, ahora voy a cambiar para inglés, porque este tuvo mejor el español que puedo. So this work here is stuff we've been doing over several years now, under mentorship of Sarah and Terry, my supervisors there at Scripps. And we've been really focused on examining more about the submesoscale dynamics, or basically the transition out of that mesoscale geostrophic balance flow into this potentially new realm where we can observe with new tools that we have now. And a lot of this has been graciously funded by NASA. This is the outline of what I want to cover today. So I'll just do some kind of recap of what submesoscale dynamics encompasses, what sort of stuff is there and what it's relevant for. And we'll also try to tie that in with what we are now capable of doing better about it with this new satellite altimeter called SWOT. And what I'll try to establish there is like one more reason why it's really important to think about currents directly, and why then hopefully build the base to demonstrate that there's a lot of value in maintaining, acquiring and maintaining current observations. And to do, you know, the overview of the science that we've done so far, I'll talk about results we did in the tropical Pacific, in the eastern side of the Pacific, by looking at these currents with these acoustic Doppler profilers that are mounted on the bottom of the ships and are kind of transiting and taking sort of snapshots of the ocean. We'll look at what we can do better about some of these ideas in the California current system, just because it's better sampled. And then we're gonna try to take what we infer from there and try to do better with our analysis back in the tropics. You will be bombarded by spectral plots in this talk. So this is just a primer for it. We always think of them as this sort of red spectrum, where energy is distributed over some horizontal wavelength. And it goes from what we kind of know better from altimetry at the large scale down to what we know a lot less in the smaller. So this is sort of the eye candy of the submesoscale things we might encounter when we're thinking about that range of scale that exists between the large and the smallest one. We'll have these sort of ideas of lots of eddies interacting. There are, you can squint, maybe here you see that you can actually see them from space when the light is just right. Even internal waves, we might have lots of it there. And if you look at their vertical, their structure can even be more striking. And when we're losing balance, you know, the influence of Earth's rotation as the scales are smaller, you know, we give rise to all these different types of instability that will play a part on what's going on dynamically. And when in that situation where you have all these different types of phenomena, these processes, and they are likely interacting, you can produce this concept of an energy cascade, where this energy that's primarily at this very large mesoscale currents has to flow down scales to ever smaller scales where they can be dissipated. And so these processes and their interactions mediate that. And through measurements of currents, so those typically that you might get from drifter pairs, you can start looking at this energy flux across scales. This is what this study tried to do here. And depending at what time of the year you look at under certain conditions, you tend to find that energy actually is flowing upscale, not downscale. So you're energizing more the eddies rather than pumping the energy down to where it can dissipate. But that might vary quite a lot in itself with scales. As they become smaller and smaller, maybe that's where the processes that are not balanced play a larger role, and you might get that kind of energy transfer down to the smaller dissipated scales. And when you do this, eventually, in this statistical form, this is sort of a similar analysis as a spectrum almost. You will need to reconcile that with our kind of more established foundations in theory and observations about how, say, waves interact with this eddy flow. And this is just one example of it when you would look at a wave action conservation, and you try to understand how the wave energy might change either through direct interactions or, you know, mediated through this turbulence. And that probably won't be that easy. In part because once you're looking at this sort of statistical metrics and big pictures, it becomes ever harder to identify who's who there and what is causing the flux of energy. So it is kind of very important to think about identifying processes more in the observations we collect. And now, as these capabilities at a global scale evolve with better and better altimeters over the years, culminating with the SWOT-1, the surface water and ocean topography mission, which uses a different type of payload. It's an interferometer that gets really cool images, because you have now 2 tracks on each side of the path of the satellite, and it gets much higher resolution with much accuracy. This is, though not entirely noise-free in their sea surface height, not quite currents, and we're getting there, and you know, we're really getting these sea surface height measurements with really good quality. This is a very recent paper that looked at gave a global overview of the basically first year and a half, I think, of the SWOT data, and showing the improvements that you get at the small scales here when you look at the variance of this height metric, right? And then now you can see, maybe here it's a bit better, we can have very detailed images of what these processes look like. So you can see internal waves, you can see internal tide solitons, you can even see signatures of surface gravity waves in some of the lower process products out there. It does show quite a lot of eddy activity, and so we're very interested in extracting the maximum information out of it. And we think, currents will be a big part of it. And just so to hammer a bit more of how good this data set is, so this is something we did years ago. We collected with underway CTD very high or resolution upper ocean profiles of temperature and salinity. We invert dynamic height along tracks here inside this larger eddy, and we computed its spectrum. That's what it shows the high variability to be. This is what, at that time, our best altimetry would do. This is basically all noise caused by probably surface gravity waves. And now the latest estimates of SWOT noise is down here. So it's bringing really these small, few tens of kilometer wavelength variability into full view. But again, they are not quite currents. That does introduce some limitations of what you might possibly try to directly do with this data. It's getting, it may only get us this geostrophic component of the total current. And as far as we can estimate from glider data here, that's only part of the story in general when you're thinking about the global ocean circulation. And as I'll try to argue more, it's even a bigger concern when you're looking at the smaller and smaller scales. So there is this implication that, geostrophic currents are not necessarily representative of what we need to know about ocean circulation. And there's also the potential, even when we can, the presence of all this geostrophic activity, all these frontal dynamics, all these internal waves, they will degrade the accuracy of what you can try to estimate from SWOT. So with that in mind, we've made this effort over the years to try to partition better the variability of the currents that we can observe into these two broad categories: eddies, vortices, that would be in geostrophic balance or very close to it, and internal waves. Partially motivated by the trying to figure out whether there's particular signatures on that data set that we can pinpoint who's who. And our tool has been this sort of near global data set of underway ADCP currents collected by the research fleet of the US. This is basically a map of where they've been. So this is data that's collected, automated by the sonars that are mounted there. They are now routine in almost all. You guys have one, probably two, doing this, and almost all institutions have a form of this. But the data set, once it goes into this databases, you need a lot of quality control over it. It's can be a very finicky type of measurement to get right. So over the years, what's been archived on that public data set is what people have post-processed at. So they've made efforts to look at the data and apply corrections and calibrations so that the measurement is of better accuracy. And we then go in there and collect all the data that's actually when the ship is moving sufficiently fast that we can treat this as some kind of synoptic snapshot sample of the ocean. And this is an example of what it looks like if you would cross a cyclonic eddy. Those are the currents on top. This is the backscatter where it shows sometimes that the sonar doesn't work, and this is a measure of the noise. So understanding this noise has been, or an impact on what we do has been a big focus. When we analyze what we do out of this is then compute this wave number spectrum metric I told you about, and then we analyze this in terms of this flow decomposition method that was developed now a number of years ago by Oliver Buehler and colleagues. It does this Helmholtz decomposition and it obtains a rotational and a divergent component for the spectrum. And when we treat the flow as linear, so there's superposition, linear superposition of these processes, there's a scaling here that connects the divergent and the rotational energy through the sort of inverse square time scale. This can be shown that this, you can reconstruct its sort of one dimension and only, remember, we're only having this along track transit. So this is basically one dimensional data. We're after quantities that actually depend on another dimension there. So we're trying to recover some information, dynamical information out of limited data. And so we use another empirical model, the Garrett-Monk spectrum model, which describes how these things would relate for linear internal waves. And that allows us to do further decomposition, kind of separate this Helmholtz, these two components, rotational and divergent, into what is more applicable to our understanding of purely balanced vortices. So they're non-divergent, they are only rotational. And then an internal wave only component, which is fully divergent. So I mean, it's divergent plus a smaller amount of rotational energy. Rotational, I mean, in the spatial sense. So these methods only work under statistical conditions that you sample over an isotropic medium. They are obviously amenable to being analyzed by spectrum. So variability has to be homogeneous over the spaces you're averaging over, and stationary. So we're looking at a historical archive of decades where sampling is uneven, and we need to treat this as sort of there are no significant trends or such during that time. So if you do that analysis, and we've looked at this from a bunch of regions in the world after an initial exploration out here and here in the early, or in the middle 2010s, we've looked at this in the database as we were looking at the currents, pulling out new cruises and seeing whether the data was any good. We started producing lots of these spectrum and looking at how they would partition. I'm going to talk to you about what happens in this area here, the Southeast Tropical Pacific. We're interested in those tropical areas because at that time, prior to SWOT launch, a lot of what was driving the ideas and expectations of what it would deliver was this global simulation, which was forced by tides, with a lot of them realistic forcing, and it actually produced what it looks like. It's very high resolution, 2 kilometer global. And so it produced this sort of blend of different phenomena at global scale. And it would show that for most of these sort of submesoscales, so any scale below what's colored here, that would be dominated by an internal wave. So it kind of gave us a guiding hypothesis to what to look for in the data sets. So when we compute our decomposition there, the wave and eddy part out there from the spectra of the ADCP, that those are the field lines here, we tend to find a very consistent picture where the orange line, there it's orange, it's much lighter than the purple one, but the eddies over that range of scales below 200 kilometers. So very much in qualitative agreement, and at times, depending on how you aggregate the data, so there's this very thin dashed line here is what we would do an analogous analysis of the model output, it's very consistent as well. So it's showing that indeed there appears to be this sort of very internal wave driven submesoscale type of regime in the tropics. But when we do this analysis, we're kind of bound by this assumptions we made, in specifically that there are just these two kinds of things, and then that there is, and that one of them obeys a very simple model of its behavior, this Garrett monk. So it kind of doesn't really include all the richness of internal waves that we've known by now.
Recording in progress.
One thing that was very striking when we were analyzing that data, so we analyzed it over. So one advantage of these shipboard ADCPs, you know, so it's not just the surface. We're mostly interested at the surface there because of the connection with satellite, but they give us, you know, the upper ocean column as well. So we were looking at this Helmholtz decomposition. So we have this divergence and rotational, and we're looking at their ratio here. And we do that because of that. In the linear sort of sense for few wave elements, you could think that there is this clear relationship between that ratio and in the time scale of the flow, sort of, or actually the inverse of it. But when you're thinking of a ratio that's very close to 1 out here, it means your variability would match what is dominated by an inertial oscillation. And as you go lower, you tend to enter the higher frequency types of internal waves. This is what, if you would obtain with the Garrett monk prediction, this is what you should be looking at on your data. Should it follow all its sort of underlying assumptions? And this is sort of what, in this latitude, the semi-diurnal tide should look like in that ratio plot. And so when we look in the interior, we have something that is resembling what you might expect, at least in this range of scales here, to what are the range of the mixture of internal wave that the Garrett monk tries to model. So the Garrett monk is basically trying to give you a kind of a broad spectrum of internal waves. Near the surface, the ratios are higher, and we're left undetermined whether that's simply because there are indeed more eddies up there. They're stronger, so smaller, stronger eddies out there, or they are something else, or other internal waves. So we started looking at more data, and that's why we headed back to the California current region, where we can look at HFR. In HFR, we can do that Helmholtz decomposition without much fewer assumptions. We have two-dimensional little maps for where we can kind of extract spatial and time scale. So that's what you're looking here at, a frequency and wave number spectrum of the rotational component and the divergent one. And this is, if you integrate over all frequencies, you get these two lines here, which we find to be, for at least the spatial scales we can resolve, smaller than the ranges we're looking at with ADCP from the area. We at least have a qualitative consistent picture where the two rotational and divergent are very close to each other. This is isolating the single semi-diurnal tide band over the scales, showing that they are much different than there's about only 20% of that total. It implies a different ratio, and that one is the only frequency band. If you then integrate overall wavelengths here, and you look at the frequency spectrum, this one is the only one that will follow those kind of linear ideas of ratio of rotational relating directly to the inverse time scale. All the others are usually associated with much higher ratios, very close to the inertial. And we find all these sort of divergent energy in very low frequencies. So not entirely consistent with that kind of picture we were using with the Garrett monk only. And just to hammer this point one more, we had conducted that cruise I was describing early off of of this point conception here, where we now collected underway CTD data, gives us this other metric we can use to analyze, internal wave dynamics and some of the low frequency dynamics as well. We have basically a metric of potential energy and even the capability of inverting that dynamic high, calculating the dynamic high. What are plotted here is again spectrum, but now there is not just the kinetic energy and its partition in divergent and rotational. It has also some potential energy spectrum here, and for comparison, the predictions of the Garrett-Monk spectrum. Again, what is striking is how much it tends to deviate from that Garrett-Monk picture, where you see much higher ratios of the kinetic energy to potential at all scales, save for this one peak here that actually shows up in the sea surface height, the dynamic height we do. So it's corresponding to the scale here, and those are actually matching some of the filaments that are wrapped around this. So it's clearly not a wave here. And outside of it, we see lots of deviation from those model spectrum. The higher ratios would be suggestive of more inertial frequencies playing a role. And another sort of not entirely inconsistent is that for very simple linear internal waves, there's actually a relationship between the divergent component only and the total amount of energy, so the sum of the potential and the kinetic. So if twice of that and 2 times the energy in the divergence should be actually equal to the total energy of the waves. So where they clearly match here at the smallest end of the scale seems to at least confirm that whatever we're seeing here, though not fitting the Garrett-Monk ideas, are consistent with what would be internal waves. So these are sort of what we go after, like fingerprints of possible culprits on what we observe. And as it goes to the larger scales, deviations start to appear. And notice that there are no uncertainty bars, because none of these are very certain they are. Basically repeated only 3 times these sections. They give us only a very small confidence range in the actual measurement. And if you propagate these measurement errors through the analysis, they are a blur on this plot. So at this point, we're basically grasping for these consistencies. But it gives us this idea that we should be, if we want to do something better, we want to look at the second step of our method and improve these internal wave parts and not maybe rely on everything that the Garrett-Monk says, in huge part because any frequency spectrum will show you these very well-established peaks at the semi-diurnal and inertial frequency. And at the very least, we want to take some kind of approximation of their impact on when we decompose or do the flow partitioning. So we worked on a minor upgrade to that method, trying to take into account some of these as delta peaks on top that exist on top of these background spectrum. So the black line here being the Garrett-Monk spectrum. You notice it's actually very hard to fit to real spectrum. This is something that is very common, and especially when you go outside mid-latitude ranges. And as you get closer to the surface, these are data from a mooring out there on the southeast tropical Pacific at 30 meters. And what we're really trying to do is estimate how they would change that parameter that we use, the empirical parameter that we use. So treating them as delta function and trying to rewrite the relationship directly with kinetic energy rather than the ratios, assuming that that we can find these 2 peaks in terms of fractions of this background spectrum here. we can have some framework that takes sort of a corrective approach to the empirical parameter here. So it modifies this Garrett-Monk one here with a few additional terms that depend on how, what, in terms of a fraction of the energy, how large the peaks are. Turns out, and then that you can deduce directly from the measured spectrum from the mooring. And if you add those into our framework there of the ratio as an inverse frequency, it makes only small changes relatively to what actually the decomposition does when we're looking at inertial peaks and semi-diurnal peaks. They are typically around 30% only of what the background energy would be. These corrections are then insufficient to sort of interpret the surface up there. So that big difference in terms of just adding adding these other frequencies to the analysis, leading us to conclude that what it mostly means is that, yes, there are enhanced eddy activity there. And if we follow further this decomposition upgrade, we can do a recalculation of it, follow the fractions, and kind of separate out that total internal wave energy that we were estimating before into something that is due to the continuum only and something that is associated with each peak. So now we wanted to use that together with sea surface height data to understand whether there was any, what of those internal wave processes would actually lead to something like a larger signal in sea surface height that may degrade, be more concerning for geostrophic velocity calculation. So we conceive that if we take these methods we do, so we sample an area very well with both ships and of course with satellite altimeters. We know quite a bit about these old altimeters, sort of their noise behavior. So we know roughly where and how to sort of estimate those things. Out of that, we also know something about a component where we don't do particularly well, the internal tides. Out of altimeters, you can estimate the stationary, sort of the phase law, the astronomical forcing component of the internal tides. So there's a model that you can plug in sea surface height. And so now that we can estimate what is the continuum one, because the continuum might have height signature, while an inertial frequency not, we can combine these things that come out of in situ data with this model coming out of sea surface height data, come up with some kind of reconstruction of what we should be observing in terms of ocean-only signal. We know typically what is the noise behavior of these conventional altimeters. And so if we look at a residual between the measurements and that reconstruction, maybe it tells us something about these processes we've been ignoring or not solving well. So that's what we've worked on last, and this is sort of the plot that gives you a sense of each component. We've estimated this continuum by converting that kinetic energy using, again, sort of these simple linear theories of internal wave. For the continuum, because we have a model that gives all those relationships per frequency, per wave number, we can do this. And that's where we get this salmon line here, indicating that's where their energy level would sit relative to the old SWOT noise reference. We sum that with the other ones, including the geostrophic, we estimate from the vortex component, and that gives that total signal reconstruction. And out here, we're looking at a similar attempt to reconstruct this continuum part from the mooring only data. So they had frequency resolved observation, and then they extrapolate the wave number part of it. So two ends of the same type of process, and we get a very similar qualitative picture between the estimate of the continuum we have from the underweight ADCP with what they obtained from that single mooring, suggesting at least we seem to be going to the right direction. And then finally, we add this onto a comparison with the actual measurement of the altimeter, taking the difference here between this observed one here, the pink line is we've done it through all basic, the conventional altimeters so far. And this is one example. They all give the same result, gladly. And this is our reconstruction, and the difference being this dashed line here. So it's our residual or unresolved processes. So we don't resolve most of it as you start getting into the wave part, right? So the signal of the continuum that we extract is too small. The balance component appears to be losing energy too fast. It's too steep. And so that residual, at least up here where we have this well sort of expected behavior of this internal tide, this mode 1 internal tide, that's where we're seeing that energy difference between the residual and what the model tide, the stationary component of that difference is roughly about 2/3 of the total energy that we measure. And that is really close to what has been estimated from Argo or a combination of altimeter and drifter data, what that non-stationary component, the ones that you cannot derive directly from altimetry, should have. And does suggest that there's quite a bit more of that energy in there that exists in this part of the ocean. And it isn't particularly an area with a strong internal tide beam. That means with all this non-stationary energy, that's where the internal tide energy is no longer very predictable. It potentially means that it's being refracting, or there's indicative of interactive processes, is again nudging us the way towards sort of concepts of pathways for interactions of energy, in where the internal tide may play an important role, even when it's not the most energetic feature. So we're here, we've got some estimate of the non-stationary tide that seems reasonable, much more than what was previously estimated from some models and altimeter attempts. And allow me to conclude the scientific things we've done with this data set so far, suggesting that whenever we looked at these tropical regions, both in model and observations, they do seem to suggest that we are at scales where internal waves play a large role. So they limit what, the scales at which geostrophy would be directly applicable. So they have this kind of very practical result. But when you attempt to reconstruct these things, they always point out to this very large role by this internal tide, this non-stationary component, the one that's hard to predict. So that's a signal that's in height very strongly, and will degrade your attempts to compute geostrophic velocity, especially if you go into you don't even necessarily have to go very far into the smaller scales, but it will become a very significant source of error if you cannot eventually filter them out. On the bright side, the fact that SWOT is outperforming these noise requirements means that now potentially you can actually start thinking about maybe it's useful to study these other waves, including the ones, not just internal tide, so that tends to be the largest signal, but in theory, the continuum part, becomes visible as well. So these are incoherent waves. They are basically one key piece of the puzzle connecting large circulation with mixing, turbulent mixing out in the open ocean. And it's one of the ideas that standard for the longest time in oceanography, and that now we perhaps have a new tool to try to look at it again. And so what we probably be doing next is trying to look at more into this problem of the velocity estimation now with the SWOT data, having built this sort of analysis framework to try to interpret everything. And then I want to end by just saying that all was possible because there was this archive of data sitting there for a long time. Literally, I would say very underused by the community. Where the US has a system for acquiring them routinely, processing and submitting them, but that's a tiny fraction of what actually gets done. There's a lot more. The data does cover well if you're not really interested in just a long track data. This is just showing how many data points. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of velocity estimates in some regions of the world. It's really good temporal coverage, except in the winter when that's mostly given by mid-latitude storms. But if you're not necessarily in a weather tough region, you probably get really good year-round coverage. And so we designed some metrics that could be useful out of this stuff, but there are many other things that can be done with it. So if you're looking, maybe you run models and you're looking for data, this is one resource that you could be thinking of now. And we made efforts to make this more readily available. And hopefully we eventually can start having a more global conversation of how to make these data more standardized and eventually a single global archive like what we have for CTV. So thank you. And
muchas gracias.
Saulo, thanks a lot for your presentation. Very, very interesting. I have a couple of questions. One is rather more technical regarding SWOT data. And my question is, how good or how bad is the cross-track information from SWOT for these purposes? Because you show only the long track signal and details, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. The cross-track needs more correction. So the SWOT does need, this part is the correlated noise that's still very much there. I think they're working on the latest and greatest correlation so that allows, that's the long track, I guess, one, but there's an even worse one for the cross track that really narrows and I think that's been solved now. I'm not the best resource on it, but I think you can almost use all of the processes. You want my only need to cut out with that. That's my understanding. It also depends a lot. They've released different flavors of this product. There are some that have additional corrections done. For example, if you're interested in the non-geostrophic part, you need to add your tides back in there. For sure, it's something we initially didn't realize it when they start first coming out. But I think the noise is much lower for velocity as well. So they seem to be using an oversampling approach. It's like a 3 kilometer oversample. It's a 2 kilometer, but it's.
You mean in the long track?
Footprint, yeah. All of that, yeah. So this sort of level 3 type of, which I think is what everybody should be using. You might not be able to view the you might not be able to view this on the level 3, but it certainly will get you this stuff here pretty well.
Yeah. Since I understood what you get is the two bands of images, you could say, right? And then you can get a long track and cross track easily.
Yeah.
So, and it is only this is the height what you need to detect these
And they
velocities.
have their geostrophic version of it, but again, that's where we're kind of arguing where you might want to be more skeptical when you can do something. Here, for example, when you're like, if you can zoom in on a feature like this, probably what you can get out of it is okay. If it's not too small, then you might, I think this paper is using actually cyclogeostrophic approximations to do the velocity out of this, but it's still the one that's available routinely. I think it's all, I'm pretty sure it's all geostrophic, or they're releasing just the slope and you do the version of it.
And my second question is on the high frequency radar that you mentioned. I think it is rather important, and I don't know if you mentioned or say something and miss it. And since with this type of radars, we can estimate the surface current, right?
Yeah.
So it is very important. Could you comment on that?
So one thing I think there's, Sarah has a person working with JPL there. They're looking at some detailed comparison of SWOT and HFR. I think it was done through that 1 day repeat phase. So it's very limited because of the region where they overlap is actually very small for that phase. I'm now interested in doing this, so I'll hope to do some of more direct things now. So the idea would be to try to, use this sort of Helmholtz decomposition, because we're now going to get to the divergent part with SWOT. So we want to have a framework where we can get something that's comparable first with the geostrophic estimates that come out of it, and then kind of back out slowly how far these things can work, whether you can do cyclogeostrophic more generally, let's say, or what instances. This would be sort of the questions we're kind of thinking of merging this, because now we can look at it in the sort of operational phase. It has this sort of sampling mode that's covering the globe with 21-day repeats, and it has this pattern where it kind of comes back and revisits your area, sometimes in a very short period of like 12 hours or so. You get a close by, not the same, right? But you get a cross pass.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have two questions. One is like maybe just to see if I really got the general idea, but what you're saying is that, well, it comes also with that, like the level, I haven't looked at any of the SWOT data, so I have no idea. But level 3, you said like the geostrophic, they do include some geostrophic velocities. And from what I understand, you're saying that, the SSH signal has a lot of other signals in there. So the level 3 data for the geostrophic velocity might not be completely right. Okay,
if
that's
you're
the point.
Depending on the scales you are looking at, then again, the big advantage is now we can finally have an image, and you can perhaps, I would say, if you look at that, again, that's why I kind of put it there, because you can always think in that term. So this is from off of the Agulhas current. So it, I would say that's a very good approximation. They were able to get very believable currents out of that there. But the main thing is if you look into the interiors of the ocean, that's where it will likely not be useful.
Okay.
Or might.
Or smaller scales or whatever. Yeah.
And it might be difficult even for scales which you would think they would be well resolved. You might have quite a bit of inaccurate, right? So considering our eddy in the interior gyre, what we see in the ADCP, a strong eddy out on the southeastern tropical Pacific is like a 20 centimeter per second current. You're easily going to have an error of 15 centimeters per second. With that.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's one. And the other one was, can you expand a little bit on on what stationary internal tide and non-stationary internal tide is, like sort of what they are and how they differ?
Yeah. So they're supposed to be just the internal tide, but then it created this almost operational definition is necessary because where would be a good frequency spectrum to describe it? The photo observed. So a long track altimetry has just the total internal tide. The internal tide, the very simple, the largest one, what we call the mode one, has this very specific wave that we're showing the wave number with a bit of bandwidth that you see there because it's not exactly always at that scale because of the waves interaction. But in frequency space, that you can see, you can recover a part that is completely phase locked, where the cycle delay is exactly at the frequency and with the solar, the lunisolar forcing, so that you can back out from repeat altimetry if you have enough years by harmonic analysis. And so that's what they extract, and then they can map. And then there's more advanced things you do to actually map the details of it, but it's fairly straightforward to map sort of the amplitude of it by that. And that's what we use here, basically, the maps of the amplitude of that. And so the difference there, once you figure out that you can remove other things, and you're looking at that may be the non-stationary, all these sort of stronger interactions of that wave with the mean flow or the background stratification that makes it deviate out of that, get out of the phase lock, and you no longer can tell what's what.
Or with topography or whatever. Or
with
waves,
topography,
right?
yeah, that's a perfect one. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So scattering, right.
Now, I mean, on the same line, a couple of things. I mean, how do you compute the spectra here? Do you assume, for example, when you show this, and you show us all the lines from all the ships or whatever, you assume mesotropy, and then you use all the data from all the tracks, and then following on that, and then you assume that you have a periodic thing in the initial position and the end position, and then you you taper the ends. And then what do you think of all the people that are criticizing these methods for computing spectra?
That's you can criticize it, but I mean, you get the spectrum. I mean,
no, but you're assuming that you have something that is, periodic, which is not periodic. And then the ends.
It's just as well.
I mean, sure. there is this group that is. I mean, all these discussions on using filters without really requiring to make the assumptions on periodicity, for example.
So for example, if we take, so there's no, I mean, to compute the spectrum in terms of, I mean, we have to think it as homogeneous as something that will satisfy that transformation. I mean, and you can, but if you want scales, that's basically the best thing you can do. I mean, if it fits a wavelength, then that's the best way to estimate it. You can argue at length whether it's exactly right, or it's obviously probably not. But the other ones, each one has sort of things we can do to gauge the size of the error. So for example, isotropy, because we sample in that, the neat thing about this kind of data set is you get lots of directions, and you can actually accumulate estimates in different directions. And we looked at for example, at that, and you typically don't see any difference when you're looking at that kind of range of scales. Then you can make averages ever smaller areas when you can, up to when you start losing confidence in the estimate. But when you retain some confidence and you look at different areas, then yeah, you like, it doesn't look that different when you really those estimates. Now, if you go to close to the Gulf Stream, then you start seeing big changes. You know, if you separate out the part of the Gulf Stream, it's clearly different. And so it does give you, again, it's all kind of with any statistical method, we do what we can to estimate the uncertainty according to the rules. But in the end, what we need to look at is whether it's consistent with the physical picture.
Right. The other one, I think, well, two. the other one is with, you know, you said, well, a lot of the submesoscale signal is in the internal waves. But then, you know, once again, like, I mean, I'm no expert in all of what I'm saying. I'm just
no, these are very valid, good questions.
I'm just reading
exactly.
papers.
No, these are great questions.
But the no, like people say, well, what makes this very complicated is trying to separate the internal tides from the submesoscale. So when you say, well, the internal tide or the internal waves are, you know, like part of the submesoscale, in what sense, or what do you mean by that?
So only in the simplest sense that we can sort of identify their energy, their amplitude. That's all we're trying to gauge with this. And I think there are studies trying to look, so that's basically the second order statistics, but now people are interested in the third order statistics with those conversations of energy flux. So that's a step above in terms of uncertainty. Like, I think we can do something about the amplitude that's, at least for now, there's a physical consistency behind the descriptions there, where models show where things happen, as, you know, in terms of waves versus vortices, it does work, but there are many times they don't work. And as far as we could track down of more fundamental errors, when we started looking at sort of the estimating the Rossby number, right? So we know the current, the measurement of the current is fine. Let's try to gauge whether that's, you know, what is the Rossby number of that, which is the fundamental thing in terms of loss of balance. And they actually look usually fairly low, because apart from these areas near the Gulf Stream, actually the velocities are kind of, they're weak. The submesoscale velocity, if you look out there in the Southeast Tropical Pacific, is almost a desert in terms of velocities. You're talking about 4 or 5 centimeter variance over that almost entire band between 100 to whatever we can resolve. It's a very hard signal to go after.
And the final one is in the partition of the energy that you know, saying, well, it's internal waves, etc., and they are very energetic, but it's in these short scales, right?
It's in the below the typically in some areas like the tropics there, it would be maybe up to 200 kilometers, where they are, at least in the currents, they're clearly there. But you know, if you think that there are also issues with the height measurement, I think that there are more issues that we were not completely fully taking stock at with the height measurement itself, not being a pure eddy, right, to look at.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question, Dora.
Thank you. I have a quite technical one, and it's how do you deal with the noise amplification when you take derivatives from the SWOT? Like, you filter later or before?
Yeah, I'm not a good resource on that. I'm sorry, but like, I think partially because we've outsourced that calculation to the data products. I think the noise is very small. I think they counted that with the oversampling that is happening now, so that there is actually it's at a grid, but it's smoother than the actual grid size. The velocity should be fairly accurate to about 8 kilometer size. So that's where they propagate the error from the base state. And so I think that's your limit there in terms of accuracy, in terms of noise. But there may be other things that are more subjective, like what I'm trying to show here.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Bueno, hay una pregunta en línea de Lidia Lada que dice, wondering, are there any coastal applications or validation to detect internal waves or internal tides?
That's a good question. We took a step at that with at least with the currents from the ADCP. Again, so it goes back to the question that that's where the methods, with a one-dimensional will completely fail. It's very anisotropic, so that the error it's very large. So we would have to rely really on the HFR surface-only currents for that. And we see what it comes out now with a more detailed SWOT comparison. But it might require its own type of filtering, I'm imagining. Thank you.